I need to say this clearly, before you decide what kind of person I am. I didn't choose wrong. I chose what was reasonable, ethical, defensible. If you heard the facts, you would probably agree with me. That's the part that still destroys me. People talk about regret as if it only follows bad decisions. As if guilt is always attached to something obviously immoral. But no one warns you about the kind of regret that comes from doing what you're supposed to do. The kind that leaves you blameless, and empty. At the time, my life was balanced. Not happy balanced. Stable job. Predictable days. Relationships that made sense on paper. I had built something solid, something others relied on. And then a moment arrived that demanded a choice. Not dramatic. Not cinematic. No countdown, no music. Just a quiet fork in the road that only I seemed to notice. Someone needed me. Not emotionally, practically. A decision had to be made. One that would affect multiple lives, not just mine. There were consequences either way, and I was the one expected to carry them. I remember sitting alone, listing outcomes like a machine. If I chose option A, I would preserve stability. Protect people from disruption. Avoid risk. If I chose option B, I would honor something deeply personal but introduce uncertainty, pain, and chaos. Every rational part of me knew what I was supposed to do. And I did it. I chose A. I chose responsibility. I chose predictability. I chose the version of myself everyone trusted. The moment passed quietly. No applause. No visible damage. Life continued exactly as it had the day before. That should have been the end of it. But something inside me didn't come with me. At first, the aftermath was subtle. I felt tired in a way sleep didn't fix. Conversations felt slightly delayed, like I was answering from a distance. I told myself it was stress. Moral weight. Temporary strain. Weeks passed. Then months. The choice became a fact. Something settled. Something irreversible. And slowly, I realized that while nothing had collapsed, nothing had expanded either. The future felt sealed. Not doomed, closed. I had done the right thing. And somehow, that made everything else feel pointless. I started noticing how often I replayed the moment not to change it, but to feel something. Anger. Doubt. Even resentment. But all I felt was understanding. I could justify the decision every single time. Which meant there was nowhere for the pain to go. When regret has no villain, it turns inward. I didn't talk about it. There was nothing to confess. Nothing illegal. Nothing shameful. How do you explain that you're grieving a life you ethically chose not to live? How do you admit that morality didn't save you? People praised me. Trusted me more. Treated me like someone dependable. Solid. Mature. Every compliment felt like a nail sealing something shut. At night, I lay awake imagining the version of me that chose differently. Not a fantasy hero, just a quieter, truer self, one who accepted uncertainty. One who took responsibility for desire, not just duty. I wondered if that version of me was happier. Or if he simply existed more fully. That thought scared me enough to push it away. I told myself this was adulthood. This was the cost of being decent. That fulfillment was a childish expectation, and integrity was its replacement. But deep down, something was rotting. I began to lose interest in things I once cared about. Music sounded flatter. Achievements felt procedural. Time started slipping in strange ways, weeks disappearing without memory. I wasn't depressed. I was disengaging. There's a difference. Depression is heavy. Disengagement is hollow. One evening, while doing something completely ordinary, the realization hit me with brutal clarity: I had survived the choice. But I had not survived myself. That was the moment I understood the true cost of doing the right thing for the wrong reasons. Not fear of consequences. Not love. But avoidance. I hadn't chosen responsibility out of strength. I had chosen it to avoid the terror of wanting something fully. And now, that unchosen want was poisoning everything quietly. I didn't hate my life. I just wasn't in it anymore. After the choice, I tried to live as if it had resolved something. That's what you're supposed to do, right? Make a decision, accept the outcome, move forward. I told myself that revisiting it was pointless. Immature. Self-indulgent. So I didn't revisit it. I buried it under productivity, under responsibility, under the quiet pride of being someone who could be counted on. From the outside, my life looked even more stable than before. As if the universe itself was rewarding me for choosing correctly. Inside, the erosion continued. It didn't scream. It didn't demand attention. It just made everything slightly harder to care about. I started going through entire days without feeling anything distinctly. Not sadness. Not joy. Just a constant internal fog, like my emotions had been wrapped in cotton. I became excellent at functioning. And terrible at existing. The worst part was that I couldn't complain. There was no injustice to point to. No external force to blame. I had consented to this life. Chosen it with open eyes. That knowledge made every moment of emptiness feel like a personal failure. I thought, if I'm unhappy, it's because I'm weak. So I tried harder. I leaned into responsibility as if it were a moral shield. Took on more. Became even more reliable. Even more contained. I told myself that meaning would eventually grow out of discipline, the way muscle grows out of strain. But meaning doesn't work like that. Meaning needs alignment. And I was misaligned at my core. I started noticing how disconnected I felt from my own reactions. Someone would tell me good news, and I'd respond correctly, but without instinct. Someone would express pain, and I'd empathize convincingly, but from a distance. I wasn't cold. I was absent. At some point, I realized that I had stopped imagining the future altogether. Not pessimistically, just blankly. When I thought about years ahead, there was nothing there. No curiosity. No anticipation. Just continuation. That terrified me. Because hope isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just the quiet assumption that tomorrow might feel different. And I no longer had that. The moral choice I had made couldn't be undone. That was part of what made it ethical in the first place. You don't get to test drive integrity. You commit to it. But commitment without truth becomes a prison. I began to understand that what I was experiencing wasn't regret over the decision itself, but grief over the self I had silenced to make it. And grief needs expression. Mine had nowhere to go. There were moments I almost told someone. Not to seek advice, but just to say it out loud, I did the right thing, and it broke something in me. But the words felt absurd. Ungrateful. Dramatic. So I stayed silent. Silence, I learned, doesn't heal. It just preserves the wound. The breakdown didn't come as a collapse. It came as an erosion of meaning so complete that even rest felt pointless. I would lie in bed exhausted, knowing that sleep would only reset the same emptiness for the next day. One night, I caught myself thinking something that scared me more than anything before: if this is the rest of my life, I don't know what I'm protecting it for. That thought wasn't suicidal. It was existential. And it told me something crucial. I wasn't afraid of dying. I was afraid of continuing like this indefinitely. That's when I understood the final cruelty of moral choices made without self-honesty: they leave you alive, respectable, and slowly disappearing. The truth I had avoided became impossible to ignore. I hadn't chosen the right option because it aligned with who I was. I had chosen it because it aligned with who I was expected to be. And expectations, once internalized, are far more powerful than any external pressure. I realized then that my silence wasn't protecting anyone anymore. It was only protecting the image of me that others relied on. And that image was costing me my inner life. The question I had been avoiding finally surfaced in its rawest form: is it ethical to sacrifice yourself completely for a decision that no longer reflects who you are? I didn't know the answer. But I knew that pretending not to ask it was destroying me. And once a truth demands to be spoken, silence stops being neutral. It becomes dangerous. The truth didn't come out in a confession. There was no dramatic moment where I finally broke down and told everything to the right person at the right time. Life isn't generous like that. The truth came out sideways. It slipped through cracks in my behavior, in my detachment, in the way I stopped engaging emotionally with things that were supposed to matter. People noticed that something was wrong long before they knew what it was. At first, they assumed stress, burnout, temporary exhaustion. I let them. Then one day, someone asked me a question I wasn't prepared for. Not what happened. Not are you okay? But, why do you look like you're already gone? That sentence did something to me. Because it named the thing I had been hiding from myself. I wasn't suffering loudly. I wasn't falling apart. I was absent. And absence, once seen, cannot be explained away. I tried to respond with logic. With context. With the careful language of someone who has spent years justifying themselves internally. But the words collapsed as soon as they left my mouth. What came out instead was quieter. I made a choice I can't undo, I said. And I don't know how to live with who I became because of it. That was it. No details. No defense. Just the truth I had avoided for so long. Saying it out loud didn't fix anything. It didn't reverse the decision. It didn't restore the self I had silenced. But it did something irreversible. It ended the pretending. Once the truth existed outside my head, I could no longer use morality as a shield against self-examination. I could no longer hide behind doing the right thing as an excuse to abandon myself completely. The consequences were immediate and uneven. Some people understood more than I expected. Others didn't understand at all. A few were angry. Not because of the decision itself, but because my honesty disrupted the version of me they depended on. And that hurt. Because I realized something painful: when you are valued for your reliability, your humanity becomes inconvenient. I lost things after that. Not all at once, not violently but clearly. Certain roles disappeared. Certain expectations dissolved. Some relationships changed shape permanently. I didn't become freer. I became exposed. Without the armor of moral certainty, I had to face a terrifying question: now that you see the cost of your choice, what are you going to do with the rest of your life? I couldn't undo the past. I couldn't reclaim the version of myself that might have existed if I'd chosen differently. That grief stayed with me. It still does. But something shifted. I stopped punishing myself for surviving. I stopped demanding that my pain be justified by wrongdoing. I accepted that it is possible to do everything right and still lose something essential, and that loss still deserves mourning. That acceptance didn't bring happiness. It brought permission. Permission to live differently now. Permission to make smaller, truer choices. Permission to stop optimizing my life for moral approval and start shaping it around internal truth. I learned that ethics without self-honesty becomes self-erasure. And that responsibility taken without consent becomes resentment. The rest of my life didn't suddenly open up. But it became real again. I began to feel time. Not as something to endure, but as something fragile. Limited. Personal. I began to choose with awareness, even when the choices were uncomfortable. I no longer needed my life to look correct. I needed it to feel inhabited. If you're listening to this and carrying a regret you can't justify one that came from doing what was expected, what was praised, what was considered right, please hear this: your pain is not invalid just because your choice was ethical. You are allowed to grieve a self you never became. You are allowed to question decisions that others still admire. And you are allowed to change how you live now, even if the past cannot be changed. The greatest tragedy isn't making the wrong choice. It's making the right one and never forgiving yourself for the part of you it cost. I'm still learning how to live with that cost. But at least now, I'm living.